Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the I'm Telling God About This podcast. So, last episode, if you haven't watched it, it's a little spicy. It's good. It's really good. But one of the things that came out of it was some really good conversation that was kind of spurred on further by some articles that I found earlier this week about what is it that we should actually be striving for or cultivating in our government as American Christians. And really, I mean, as Christians anywhere, but specifically as American Christians. How many of you have been in a situation like this where, you think, hey, you know what? I want to vote on an issue along my religious convictions. And maybe you talk about that, or maybe it comes up in conversation, and then a friend or somebody nearby or someone points out, like, what are you trying to do? Make this a Christian? Like, we're not a Christian nation.
You
Like,
can't
we're not a
legislate your
theocracy.
morality. Yeah.
Right, you can't legislate morality. What, like, and so, what are you trying to be, like the Ayatollah? Like, we have separation of church and state for a reason. Like, what do we do with that? Like, how do we navigate that? And one of the main places that we see this kind of developing is in, like, the battle for, education and funds for education. So before we get into that, go ahead and take a second and like and subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss an episode. And with that, we are off to the races.
Like and subscribe, because here's the thing. Here's the interesting thing. We had 17, last I checked, 17 comments for less than 100 views. There is absolutely no way that we haven't been throttled in that last video.
Right.
But
We've
sure.
got the conservative persecution complex of big tech already.
But
we also
here's
don't
the
want
thing.
to be that. We don't
Here's
want to
the
be
thing.
that channel that talks about our view count. So we hope that you find value here. We hope that you're enjoying these conversations. And by the way, shout out Grizzled Millennial for sticking with us through the last one.
Let's
and
go.
Guys,
even if you watch
part
half
of this,
it's good.
Part of this is that we will disagree. We will have contention. And I think more than anything, the higher level of wherever we go in these conversations, it's like, hey, we are digging deep and there's no easy button here. And so that's what we're here to showcase for you guys as you guys listen.
Well, and that's the thing, too. We want to strive to steelman the opposition as best as we can. We also ask that everybody try to steelman our position. And that's the way that we figure out what our, help communicate what our position is by doing this, by having open discussion, by having open dialogue, having permission to disagree, even vehemently, right? One of the things that I think is helpful for these types of conversations is it causes, at least for me personally, to kind of take a step back and be like, am I saying what I mean? Am I saying do I need to maybe look into what I think more? And am I disagreeing really ultimately with what somebody is saying, or am I disagreeing with the ultimate implication that I'm maybe misinterpreting or thinking about? So and I think discussions like this are super important. And if you're not having these types of discussions in your life, even with people that you are within your own echo chamber, because everybody's going to disagree on some level, right? If you're not having these types of discussions, you're not making yourself better. You're not helping that conversation move forward.
Yeah,
Well,
and
part
to
of
be
it is
clear,
you guys need to learn how to disagree with each other and be friends. Like, that's the thing that we hear people watch us talk, because we've all been friends for a long time. It's like, wow, do you guys even like each other?
Yeah. My dad called me. He's like, "Was that like? That was really intense." But this is why. This is part of the reason this podcast came about. Is because even within Christian circles, and I want to be clear, if you're not a Christian and you're watching this and you think that we are promoting or like we're putting this out there for some other reason or some other motive, I want to be very, very clear. This is communication for the church, for Christians. So if you're here and you're offended by this and you're not a Christian, that's not surprising. Like, some things that we say, we're making truth claims. We're making absolute statements. We are speaking in the context of the body of Christ.
Right.
So
if you're not a Christian, you're going to hell. All right.
Yeah.
That's the starting point of
of the
But
whole,
we don't want you to end up
want
there.
you to.
And
Yeah.
we are
No.
hospitable people.
we try.
But
Read
yeah,
the
that's
comments.
the bookend
Read the
of
comments. Even our
offensiveness.
haters. Even our haters come back for more.
The room you have walked into is a group of 4 guys that have been friends for the better part of the decade plus, some 2 decades.
20.
And
20 years.
And we're like, hey, we have these conversations on the reg, but I think a lot of people would benefit from these. And really, I love it. So it's like, yes, come along with us, even if you're not a Christian, because, man, Jesus loves you, and we love you too.
Right. So with that, let's get into the so we talk about like one of these events or examples of this type of thing and where it comes up, right? So I'm reading this article. It's in Mother Jones. It's called Christian Nationalists Are Opening Private Schools and Taxpayers Are Funding Them. Heaven forbid.
All of those titles are just flamboyant.
Right.
It's like we need to define all of
the
them.
New Yorker, the Atlantic, Mother Jones. They're just, if you don't at least read the headlines from these publications, you are missing.
You're missing out. You're missing out.
Good humor.
So good. So good. And,
So
they
good.
basically spend, what's hilarious is they're talking about this disturbing new trend of states allowing taxpayers to decide where the money that they spend in taxes that go towards education, where that money goes. Because a lot of people may not realize this, but a lot of times when we talk about socialist nations or why we should pay more in taxes and all these things, right? People will point to places like, here in Europe where, oh, well, the schools are so great and they pay a high tax and they do all these different things. Here's what people don't understand. Europe is incredibly homogenous. That's why, like, these tiny little countries
What's that mean?
are so homogenous means that they're all the same. They're very alike, right? Culturally. So, like,
In contrast
Germany
to like
is
the
not
high level
far
of
from
diversity in
France.
the United States.
Right. We're very diverse. Like, I could drop you in most towns in America, and you really probably wouldn't know where you were because you're going to see the same things. Walmart, Taco Bell, Home Depot, the exact same stuff off the same highway exits with different numbers. So, there's not a lot of this. Right, exactly. Well, there's hardly anything local to shop if you want to. If it is, it's literally a novelty. It's like we're one of those mom and pop stores, not like an actual mom and pop store. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
go into your average mom and pop store,
style.
buy a place. It's been open for 5 years. You know what I mean? Or like 10 years. But it's got the aesthetic of like decades of wear and tear. Anyway, my point is this. These countries have great social services in a lot of cases. But that's because they are able to cater to a population that's basically all the same. What we have in America is we
Melting
pay
pot.
money in taxes for services that then we can't use or we can't use fully. So then we pay out of pocket at a premium. And so
Yeah.
we're
Oh,
double
yeah.
paying for everything. And no place is this bigger than with education.
Yeah. No, I mean, I
Right,
love this
and-
conversation because I'm going to homeschool my kids, but I still have to pay my taxes. So there's a form of double payment there. And then, from COVID, plenty of, like, a huge percentage of people started, even, secular non-Christian individuals started homeschooling their kids. So I think the education system in general is coming for an awakening very soon because they're not going to be anybody in them. And the decline since they really started to standardize testing, like the test scores have been going downhill. I'm getting my doctorate in education right now, and it is a ish show, let me just tell you. And I would do anything to not allow my children to go to public school. So I love this conversation because, man, if the state of Virginia were to say, hey, let's go to the voucher system, I would be able to afford and consider being able to send my children to a school and, make different decisions.
private school.
But
Yeah. And that's one of the
'Cause
things that happened here in Texas is there was the I think it was an amendment or like a bill that was about reforming education, and it was sent up to Greg Abbott. And one of the things that was in there originally was a voucher system, so that taxpayers could use that money that is essentially tied to a school could then be tied to the child, and so.
Yes.
Whether it be like
Yes.
$13,000 a year or something that's per child, that $13,000 could go toward whatever the child wanted, like whatever school. So you could do private schools, you could do
And that didn't
potentially
make it through
homeschool,
all the way?
things like that. And that was the one, that voucher, that was the one thing, at least I don't know in depth about it, but it was one of the things that got chopped right before it got passed.
Yeah, the reason
so-
for that is very simple. Because what ends up happening is this. When they tie the money to the student, what that means is that the budget for the counties gets cut. And so, because if there's not high enrollment, then they lose money. And so then, and this is the issue, that whole system was structured so that it doesn't incentivize, it's not consumerist, it's socialist. In other words, it's not free market. Good teachers don't get hired because they're good. They get hired because whenever they got hired, they basically get in place and then they can just stay there. Their performance doesn't factor into whether or not they get.
Well, and teachers will argue that there's no actual way you can even evaluate the performance of a teacher in the first place. It's like, oh, okay, well, we'll give you. I know, right? Yeah. You to hear, because I've seen plenty of arguments both in person and in writing where teachers really genuinely assert that it's just this inscrutable, unknowable thing to see how good of a job a teacher's doing. It's like, well, if we give your students a standardized test, well, what if I have all the dumb students and so on?
And you're still not allowed to fail students, so you have a duality of problems where you also cannot, the system is soft, and
and these are all practical things. These are all practical legal things. But where this argument relates to what we're talking about today is around the notion that if I take that voucher and I send my child to a Christian private school, right? Or if I decide to open a Christian private school and then I take, I put a public school out of business, the argument that people are making is, well, now these are federally funded religious organizations. And that's against the separation of church and state. They even did this to me, actually, believe it or not, as a chaplain. Part of the reason I had to go to the reserves to go to seminary and use my post 9/11 GI Bill, where the lawyers get to be on active duty and have their school paid for by the federal government. They won't pay for religious education, even though it's a master's degree, and they still paid for it with my GI Bill. They wouldn't pay for it as part of the government program because of a, in my opinion, erroneous interpretation of, a separation of church and state. But this is an argument. And so here's the question. Is that really what the founders intended? And, we're not going to get a historical lesson here, but more importantly, is that what we should promote?
Do Christians have a right to actually implement those things at the government level?
Right. That's the real question. Should we?
That's the real assertion that I think the opposite side makes. It says, well, you can't use the government for literally anything that breathes in the direction of religiosity. And I totally disagree with the distinction that they make there, and it's because your religion, your ideology doesn't have temples and priests by name, therefore you're not using the government in service of your ideology.
Promote a worldview.
Look what month it is, okay?
And my question too is, is it me? Did I lose you guys? Good. Okay. My question too is comparable analogy. Not sure if this fits, but maybe the separation of church and state is the problem, but say we talk about some other level of federal funding on a erroneous kind of topic like food stamps or something, right? You can go spend your money however you want on all the trash food that you want, and no one's legislating, well, you can only buy the healthy food or right? I think part of my frustration with this conversation is the granular nature of no, this is freedom of choice. You could go to a secular private school. You could go to a Catholic private school. You could go to a Christian private school. You could go to any number of, any other kind of educational institution. And why do we get hung up on federal dollars could be funding Christian schools? No, federal dollars are just funding education for the child, and the parent gets to choose, which goes back to the other problem of parent choice. Parents are having their choices removed every which way.
And the cornerstone of that debate that I don't think most people really realize is what's happening is that, and this is true legally, but it's been decayed in practice, is that all the institutions that interact with your child operate on the basis of delegated authority. Okay, that's supposed to be true. So, for example, sometimes you'll see people misguidedly say things like, oh, well, the children have a right to X. Actually, children don't have legal rights in most of the senses where you would think of an adult having them. Children, in the legal parlance, are part and parcel of their parents, right? And so that kind of case law gets really well developed when the state has to make a determination of like parent fitness, right? Where it's like, well, they've become dangerous to the point where you actually strip their right to have the delegated authority. But the idea, and most teachers really do think this, and proponents of the existing form of the education system believe that they have separate co-equal authority and goals for your children, when in reality they and can do better. And that's not the case, and that has never really been addressed directly in law in the United States. But it's true, like you would literally think that, you know, teachers were some ordained role by the founding fathers and God himself, the way they believe that there is a affirmative right that they own your children for 8 hours a day, and you shouldn't have any say in what they're taught while they're doing all of the, you know, degenerate pride BS.
And it wasn't a mandatory thing for children to actually attend a school early on. I mean, most kids
not until the
barely
70s.
got out. Yeah,
Wow.
so I mean, you had families that literally would have they would have their own businesses, and the mom and the dad and the kids would run the business.
Yeah.
You know, it wasn't until I think it was the Industrial Revolution that brought the fathers outside of the home. And then, you know, so like there was this, you hear stories of generations past where these, you know, my grandfather only had a 5th grade education level before he left school and went back to the farm to help.
He was smarter than you.
You know, and he was still smarter.
Well,
Right?
okay, Josh, so take this for instance. I literally, while we're talking, all right, I get a notification. Man, something just happened with my headphone. I get a notification, and it's literally for a BuzzFeed article that, I kid you not, we must be right on the bubble here with this, because it says, the playbook for authoritarianism, here's what you need to know about Project 25 and why you should care. Do you know what Project 25 is? Here's what Project 25 is. Project 25 rejects the premise that, what's it called? I guess it's covering a bunch of different things, but it's basically around a couple different things. Looks like there's some stuff about abortion, but also the biggest thing is the Department of Education would no longer exist. It basically says that federal education policy should be limited, and ultimately the federal Department of Education should be limited. And this is what it comes down to. Our country had an ideal to say that, hey, we should make sure that education is available to everyone. All right?
Yes.
Right. That's a good thing.
Which we can all agree with, yeah.
Sure. But the question is, how...
We can't all agree, guys. It's bad content.
I know. How do you create...
what
I'm not
extent,
actually asking us this to debate that, but I'm saying, like, how do you say...
So ready.
I know. How do you make that available? And then here's the bigger question. Should it have been a state mandate? You know, this is the cool thing about our laws and the way our system was designed to work. The way the system was designed to work was the federal government says all states will provide education for, you know, children ages whatever. The execution of that belongs to the states. And in those individual communities, they get to decide how they do that, whether or not they want to use a voucher system, whether or not they're going to, create a state school specific, and, you know, you can get a tax exemption for not having your child in that system of a percentage, but like the states would get to decide that. But ultimately, what this is coming down to is this, that we should have the ability as Christians to say, you know, I want my kids to be educated in a specific way, and I also want people to have, if this is you, I want their children to have access to education. And so how do I hold those two things in tension and say, I'm not telling you how to live your life, but
Don't
take
tell
this
me how to live
Arizona
mine.
state. Like in Arizona, they decided, hey, we want to allow our kids our citizens to choose where their tax money is spent for education. And what is happening is a national news source is pulling that choice of that community and elevating it to a national level and saying, these people
Bad.
are trying to radicalize. They're violating
you meant
separation
Mother
of church
Jones
and states.
when you said national
Jones.
news source.
Sorry, I'm not
for context.
But
for context with this conversation, it says we currently have 21 states that have this program.
Yeah.
Montana, Arizona, Utah, Oklahoma, Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, West Virginia, Arkansas, Alabama, North Carolina, Florida, and I guess, Josh, you said Texas just got it, but hasn't gotten it yet. So, 21 states is a lot of states. So, why is this being elevated to a national thing? I think even that's
because it takes away the power of the centralized. It takes away power of the centralized government. Because here's the thing: ultimately, if we start, and it's the same reason why, like what you mentioned, why Texas, I think, didn't pass the voucher or took the voucher system out, because it would essentially lower the funding for the counties, and ultimately the people that are making the laws and the mayors and the councils and the education staff, they're going to lose money ultimately at the end of the day, unless they can provide a competitive system in which their school is the one that everybody is desiring, and so then all the kids are bringing their children to that school, because you can literally choose the school too, with that voucher system. You don't have to stay within your own county. Now, oftentimes, right now, property taxes is often what funds or helps put money towards the school, the local schools. And so, the I guess more uppity the neighborhoods, the more funding the school has, because therefore, more property taxes, then therefore more funding for the schools. But if we kind of eliminate that feature or some of that factor to it and put that money towards the child, then, you could have a success. One of the other things I did want to mention with this before we kind of move on with when it comes to schools and the ways that schools kind of find success, or maybe, for instance, where you're saying teachers can't be assessed on good teaching, or maybe they got all the dumb kids. One of the things that I think also factors into it, well, it's not the majority, it is a factor. I think one of the things that I found that is important is the parent involvement in their child's education within that school. Oftentimes, I have in-laws that are both, retired teachers, and oftentimes the biggest conversation that we would have is how parents didn't really care about their kids' education. They would not force their children to do homework. They would not even care if their kids showed up. It became a complete daycare system. Now, that is not to say that there isn't genuine effort being put towards, the students. And on the converse, it's not to say that there aren't teachers who just don't care, and aren't putting forth that effort. But I would say that parent involvement in schools and their child's education is also a big factor on the success of the child's education as well.
No, I disagree. Not in so much in principle, but in the idea that that's any kind of practical solution. And the reason I say that is because the existing monolithic system that we have is so fundamentally broken. There's no amount of parent involvement or anything else that's actually going to fix it. I agree,
and that's why I said it wasn't. It was one factor. I think that also helped.
If you have involved parents who are invested in the education of their children, it doesn't really matter where you go, right? The whole premise of having a school is that you're outsourcing this to someone who can supposedly do it better. And frankly, I think it's a little bit of a cop-out to say, well, we can't do this without help. It's well then, if you can't do it without help, and when you do have help, you become unnecessary because of the involvement of the parents, what would you say you're contributing to this process?
I don't think
you're
we
not
would disagree.
Suggesting, but
but
you're not suggesting that we're farming out our full-blown education to our children. No, not you, Josh. No. I meant Tim. But I was saying that.
I agree.
But even the argument of the negligent parent doesn't, the school voucher system doesn't break that.
No,
right? Exactly.
That doesn't change anything. It's almost a moot point. It's you could be a horrible parent that is not engaged in your child's education, but you are still mandated by law to put your children in education. Close your eyes and point at the wall and pick a spot if you're a crappy parent. But it will solve the problem of the parents that want to be engaged.
Part of the reason those schools fail is because the limitations they have on the spectrum of the way they're allowed to interact with children is so rigid that they can't implement any discipline that would actually be effective, which is why we just have this hodgepodge of zero tolerance policies that are really just designed to create, prison-like order rather than actually nurture a constructive environment. And so if you go back to expressly delegated authority, where it's not like this principal thing where the parent hypothetically gives it to the school that they have to send their kids to, and instead they're choosing, right? Like if I entrust my child to someone who I've chosen and I trust, and I say, they're going to put you on timeout for longer than you're comfortable with if you don't obey them, then I don't need to sit there and police them with respect to their education when they come home if I've provided those effective levers of delegated authority to someone else. The issue is that nobody trusts the teachers and the administration of their schools enough to have the amount of authority that it would take to actually do that.
Yeah, and here's the ultimate thing. You know, people talk about teachers who say you can't assess a good teacher. Yeah, you can. Parents assess good teachers by the quality of what comes home at the end of the day. It's that simple. Right?
And they would assess it by no longer sending their kids to
and that's what they're afraid of. So Josh, to your point, this is why Texas didn't do that, and why a lot of states haven't done that, is because they know, these parents, these schools know that if given a choice, they will not send their kids there, because they see what they're dealing with. Like, why would I send my kids? And it's we talked about this before, forced integration of different worldviews in place. Like, why would I choose as a person who, like, I have the opportunity and the things that I have in my life and the education and the life lessons because my dad sacrificed and then my grandfather sacrificed. And so at one point in time, my family were poor immigrant, farmers or, dock workers and whatnot who came in from, the other side of the world. And yet, did they have a lot of opportunity for education? No, they did not. Right. But we've worked. The family has progressed to a place where it's like, why would I put my kids in with people who I'm not even just talking about socioeconomic, I'm talking about value systems. I'm literally like, part of the reason I'm pulling my kids out of the DoD school system is, even just yesterday I'm having a conversation with my daughter and she sees like an animatronic thing and she's like, Dad, what's Friday Night at Freddy's? And I'm like, how do you know about that?
Right.
And
I don't
she's
know
like,
about that. What's Friday Night at Freddy's?
Right. It's basically like evil or Five Nights, whatever it is. It's like imagine Chuck E. Cheese. You remember the animatronics at Chuck E. Cheese back in the day? Yeah. Imagine if those were like trying to kill you in the dark.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
It's
it's the same thing
as video game.
When we were kids, it was Freddy Krueger.
It wasn't any good. But that wasn't good. I'm just saying,
I'm not saying it was good, but I'm saying it's the same. It's the same kind of.
No, I agree.
It's the same
but my
thing
point
that
is,
there's the influences are there, right?
Right, and they're going to be there.
Back to the values point, like, I literally yesterday heard a story from a private Christian school of a student whose father just passed away and was talking about licking balls. And the kids came home, told their parents about it, and it's like, it's a bad situation all around. But, like, no matter what, this stuff's going to happen wherever your children are educated. However, you want them to be attached to an entity that at least shares closely to your value system.
Or that will be corrected once it's
or
like
notified, or like, hey, we need to let our parents know that this happened, and we need to, the village environment is working together to support the children as they grow.
This is a good transition.
That's not happening in public school.
So this gets to the point, right? What is our job? So do we want a theocracy? Like, are we trying to say that we need like Christendom, right? Like Handmaid's Tale, where our rules are all exactly, it's a full-blown, theocracy. I love, and I was thinking about this a little later on.
Again, Josh?
Theocracy is basically a religious government, okay, an explicitly religious government. So I was thinking about some of the comments that Josh made in the last podcast episode. And one of the things I did think about, after the fact, when Israel asked for a king, God was like, you don't need a king. You don't need a king. You got me, right? You got me. I'm taking care of it. Listen, if you got a king, your sons are going to go to war and they're going to die. It's going to take all your money. It's going to complicate your life. And like, you got a king. Just follow me. Do what I tell you, and things are going to be good. I've given you the law, so God gives us the law, right? So this is that ultimate tension, I think, that Christians feel a lot of times. Is like, on the one hand, there's this libertarian bent of like, I want to make the choice that Israel didn't make, and I want to be like, you know what? No, we're good. We don't need a king. We'll be the nomads, the libertarian nomads of Yahweh, and you guys can and you guys can keep your government. Right? We'll make a T-shirts for that, libertarian nomads of Yahweh. And
that's a podcast name.
Yeah, right. So like we want that. There's the one hand, right?
1%.
But then there's the reality. We keep going back to this like idealistic versus pragmatic, and it's like the pragmatic reality is we live in a country under a certain set of rules right now. Now the good news is that country, our government exists to promote good and punish evil, and the definition of the way that our government defines good and evil is based on a Judeo-Christian ethic and moral. That's where our Bill of Rights and our Declaration of Independence and our
can I
founding
stop
documents
you
come
right
from.
there for
Yeah,
just a minute?
go ahead.
Because obviously there's people who have contrived arguments where they disagree with that. Okay.
Sure. They're entitled to be wrong. That's fine.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if I would say people are entitled to be wrong. Anyway. But the reason I say is that let's say you think it's not based on a Judeo-Christian ethic. Well, it is based on some ethic. It is.
Right. Moral foundation.
Right. Exactly. Some ethical, moral foundation.
Ethics.
Now you may not agree that it's Christianity, but we all agree that the implementation of our laws is supposed to be based on
a common understanding of good and evil.
Ought to do. And then there's like a secondary restraining layer of, okay, maybe not all things that are wrong are the role of government to prohibit, right? And that's a separate conversation. But foundationally, the argument is just on, well, which ethic are we talking about? And so usually you'll see this
moral,
sort of...
Tim, moral. Just so we're clear.
What distinction
morality,
do you feel like you're making there that...
It's the real one, the academic one. The morals are the foundation on which we understand, like, this is what right and wrong is.
Right.
It's
They exist
actual
outside of-
defining. So God, in Christian theology, the character, nature, and being of God, holiness, is good. Everything that is not
I'm
holiness
intentionally
is evil.
using a more
Moral.
secular philosophical
So what I'm saying, I'm
phrase
using
to
that
incorporate
that's what I'm trying to.
competing-
But it's important because I deal with this every freaking day, and it drives me
Yep.
bananas. Morals is the foundation. Ethics are the systems by which we judge the morality, i.e., laws and legal documents. So we have laws and legal documents that are ethical systems. They seek to distill and communicate and judge the rightness or wrongness of a thing. But we codify the rightness of wrongness. That moral foundation, that has to be mutually held. It's a standard.
Yeah.
The only reason our system works as a non-theocracy is because people who had different views of who God is or what God is, their definition of God and our definition of God were close enough that they shared similar attributes and traits.
Right, because here's the thing: if you are a dispensationalist and someone else believes in covenant theology, you don't that's not a basis for disagreeing about what the government is supposed to do in legislation.
Right, not at all. Yeah, not at all.
So, and if you're outside
totally
of
agree.
the if you're outside of Christendom and you're wondering what covenant theology and dispensationalism is, welcome to. We've just pulled back the veil into the green room. Come find out what that is and ask us about it.
But no,
so
Tim,
the reason I say all of that though is because there's this lie that says, oh, well, you're just trying to legislate your morality. And it's like, no, we're arguing about which morality. And so when you can't push your Christians, well, you can't push your secular deranged idea of what right and wrong
Tim,
are on anybody
point.
else without,
No, great point, because this is the issue. This is what I'm saying for Christians listening to this. Here's what you get to say as a Christian. I can look at the founding documents, and I can look at because they tell us what right and wrong is in many cases, because they're pulled straight from the Bible. And I can look at that and I can point to that and say, what you're suggesting is wrong because it literally undermines these founding documents. Like,
well, right, and that was the one of the critical things within the constitutional system was not establishing, because it wasn't revolutionary to establish Christendom as some basis for morality. That was not a new or surprising thing.
They were literally, we hold these truths to be self-evident.
What was innovative about it was a cohesive framework for setting guardrails around what the government would or would not be responsible for making legal or illegal on the basis of that morality.
Liberty.
And so
that is literally the premise of liberty. That was the hotness that came from it. And we took it largely from the Swiss too, but the whole notion, how do we restrict what we make laws about. And the way that they did that was through a separation of power, through 3 levels of government, and a republic system of representative democracy with a federal and state legislatures. And what that did was it allowed us to say we commonly hold that these highest truths should be promoted across the union, and those things and those things only should be legislated at the federal level. Everything else should be given to the states to preserve liberty for every community. Because guess what? If you think our culture is diverse now, like, the 13 colonies couldn't get their crap together for a reason, because some of them were staunch Catholics, some of them were staunch Quakers, some of them had just been fighting. Their granddads were killing each other during the Reformation just 100 years, a couple hundred years before. Like, our founding, the geopolitical infrastructure of our country at that time was all about the preservation of liberty and the pursuit of common good. And that is what people need to remember, that when you vote, it's okay to say, I don't think that should be federally legal. Why? Because it has nothing to do with, like, that's why we have, and now I'm going to space on it, and this is making me sad, but the limited powers, which amendment is that? Basically, if it's not outlined in the Constitution.
The enumerated powers.
The enumerated powers Act. That literally exists to say, so like when people are sitting here saying this Project 25 thing, it's authoritarian to suggest that there shouldn't be a Department of Education. No, nerd, it's not in the Constitution, so there shouldn't be. Show me where the Department of Education is listed in the Constitution of the United States. Kick rocks, nerd. Kick rocks.
And that's how we get to this conflict we have today, when it's like, should it be illegal to paint crosswalks with pride flags? It's yes. It absolutely should, because you have overstepped the role of government by enforcing your wingnut ideology, and it's just extra worse that it's antithetical to the actual moral basis of the system of laws that we have.
Right. Or if we have a town ordinance that says that, the federal government's not coming in and telling my town in my state what we can and cannot teach. If I want to have the 10 Commandments in front of every classroom in my school that is state funded, emphasis added, right? Not federally funded, state funded, or county funded, or me funded. You can't come in my dojo and tell me what to do. That's literally how our country was founded.
Well, and here's the question that I have for people that I would be opposed. Like, why is it a Christian morality, right? We have Islam, we have Hinduism, we've got Judaism, we've got all these things. Why is it a Christian or Judeo-Christian morality that we have as a foundation as our founding fathers, and why do we stick to that? Why can't that evolve to include Islamic values and foundations? And I think that the reality is we need to ask ourselves like a practical question. Which religion has had the most positive functionality or the positive impact on societies and on
Can you read?
On,
You're welcome.
And so like we don't have that in Islam, right? Where Islam goes, we don't start seeing schools pop up. We don't start seeing the progress, not as a progress, but like the flourishing of humanity. We don't see that in Judaism. We don't see that like exclusively. We don't see that in Hinduism. We don't see that with any other religion except for a Judeo-Christian moral system.
You're totally correct. But the lie that most people are basing this argument on when they have it is not, should it be Islam or Hinduism or Judaism or whatever? That's not the argument that their secular friends are making. Their secular friends have this notion, and to some extent it's even ingrained within Christians, that there's this realm of neutral morality that is a-religious.
Yeah.
Right. There is no,
so they
and
think,
that's the thing. You go ahead. Finish that thought. I want to jump on.
Well, and so that's the lie, right? It says, I'm not enforcing my morality. It's just called being a decent person, right? Like
according to what standard,
which is based on, what is it, John? The golden rule, what Jesus says, right?
And so they want to argue because you'll see this when they say like, you can reject LGBT people if you want, but I stand in love, and it's like. But you're making a value judgment, right? You're making a value judgment about what. That's not a neutral
dude. If I got
let's
dime for every time in marital counseling or relationship counseling where I start by the question is, can you just do me a quick favor and just, how do you define love?
Like, that's a good way to start, man.
Can you just
that will set the foundation for the entire conversation.
And literally, once they do it, I'm like, okay, now I know it's wrong. I'm like, what? Yeah. I'm like, you don't know, like, what you're acting like you're literally. It's like watching kids play, doctor, and like one of them's running over and stabbing him with the knife, and it's like, what are you doing? I'm playing doctor. I'm like, do you know what you're doing? Like you're literally stabbing him.
Josh, love is just a feeling, Josh. If I don't feel, I can't control the love that I feel.
Yeah, but even that, why? And that's always what I ask them. I go back to this whole thing of like, you want to get rid of morality. Oh, come on. You want to get rid of morality, and so I ask the question: is like where? Help me understand you. Where do you get this deep sense of conviction over nothingness, and then turn and put such a high premium of evidence on my truth claims? You literally are willing to move heaven and earth and like bend over backwards for people, for a moral system that you can't even communicate, let alone like tell me how it works.
Perfect example of what's happening in Europe when you have the writer of the book The God Delusion, right? Richard Dawkins, who's one of the original four horsemen of the new atheist movement, who goes on an interview and says specifically, well, look, I consider myself a cultural Christian because, Christianity as a basis of morals is a good thing for our society. It is not an Islamic basis for our moral system in the UK.
And it's a concession to the fact that no atheist has ever come up with an actual compelling, and when I say compelling, I mean something that resonates with people, something to base that morality on that's inherently interpretable. Yeah,
exactly.
And so they will sometimes come up with these abstract contrivances where they claim they've come up with a non-religious basis for morality, but they all fall apart under pretty basic scrutiny.
With that foundation set, and this is for the Christian who's thinking, well, we shouldn't, maybe going to the extent where you're like, we shouldn't, legislate morality to the extent where that's not what I was saying, but in the sense of, or a non-Christian that's saying, well, why Christianity? Why should we? Let's set the foundation, right? That the most flourishing societies are based on a Judeo-Christian moral system where we write ethical systems of how to implement that. Like, there may be more debate over that, but I'm saying when it comes to a Judeo-Christian moral basis
Josh.
And foundation, right? Like, we can agree, but
they won't. Do you know why they won't agree? Yeah, I hear what you're saying, but here's the reality. This is the problem. This is why it's fundamentally rejected. This is why it's fundamentally rejected. Jesus was a good teacher. Jesus was these different things. No. Jesus was God.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus was holy. And why is that important? Because the fruit of the tree,
right?
The fruit of the tree is holiness. The good is holiness. And you can't make that distinction because ultimately, philosophically, when you draw the line as a judge or as a lawyer, if you're trying to make a case and you're building it up from the ground up, eventually you get to a point where it's where I have to have a law of what's it called? What's the word I'm looking for? Irreducible complexity, where I get to a point where I have to define the isness of a thing.
Right.
And ultimately, the isness of good is simple. It is God. It is holiness. Mm-hmm. That is the isness
the ultimate
of good.
Standard. Yeah.
And you cannot dilute that understanding. If you fail to accept that God is the creator, God, originator of the universe, then he is not in fact unique. If he is not in fact unique, then good is not in and of itself a thing. Light is not in and of itself a thing. And that's where you get into this duality and this relativist. And it's so magnificent to me how complex and rich and deep and unbesmirchable it is, that if you try to move the standard just a little bit, you break the whole thing. And there's nothing on earth that you can show me as a moral foundation that comes close to that in a human context. Like, that's the reality. So we will never get them to understand that. And the founders knew this. What the founders could not have foreseen or did not foresee is a world in which people would simply look and say, there is no God. or at least that the majority of people would look and say that there is no God. Because up until that point in history, there were people who had differing opinions, but they were by far the minority globally. And so here we are in this postmodern relativistic world using a government built by a bunch of theists and Christians, and we're trying to figure out why it doesn't work properly. And so what I would just tell Christians is simply this: vote according to your convictions based on the character and nature and the holiness of God. Ask yourself, would God do this? If Jesus was here and I was casting this vote, would he be in support of this? Is Jesus in the business of allowing sinners to continue to sin and unto death? Hey, their freedom is preserved. They can do that. But should we? I mean, what does Jesus say about children? That's why the school thing is such a hot button issue. What does Jesus say when he talks about people leading children astray? He's like, it'd be better for you to have a what tied around your neck?
Millstone.
A millstone.
The Millstone Award.
Now that's an award I can get behind.
Right? It's that it'd be better to have a millstone tied around your neck than to lead one of these young ones astray. So yeah, sorry, I'm gonna get off my soapbox.
I think that's
the takeaway.
That's a good place to kind of land this plane for this episode. So ultimately, the answer is, God is the source of morality, and if you try to get around that, you find yourself with some sort of secular, humanist, nihilistic, ethic or morality that just doesn't work, and we see how that destroys countries from within. So, on that
Don't
note,
let yourself
I think that's a good
browbeat into how you educate your children.
Right.
Facts.
So with that,
subscribe.
like and
See you next time.
Thanks for
See
hanging
you
out.
on the next one.